Hello, everyone. Before we get started with episode 56 of FECast, Who's the Beatdown? Just a couple quick plugs, as always. First of all, huge shout out to our patrons at patreon.com. These people let us keep on going with FECast and make a new episode as often as we can. So, huge shout out to Pre-Weebin, Cotillion, Work Done Son, Chamomile, Chrissier, D-Dub, and Yeastout for their continued support of FECast. If you would like to be like these lovely people and donate at patreon.com/Friends of Eternal, we will be very grateful. Speaking of grateful, I am grateful for the editor. SRFS does an excellent job of editing FECast every week and deserves a ton of recognition. So thank you to them. Finally, if you're not already a part of the Friends of Eternal Discord, I strongly recommend it if you're trying to get better at Eternal. Link is in the description. You get to chat with cool people such as us on a regular basis. And without further ado, we're going to get on to Stormblessed's topic of Who's the Beatdown? Here we go. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to FECast, the official podcast of Friends of Eternal. I am Sunyveil, one of your hosts, and today I am joined by my friend and co-host Stormblessed, and we're going to talk about something that Stormblessed has been alluding to a lot in recent weeks.
Yeah, so on this episode of FECast, we are going to be discussing Who's the Beatdown, which is my sort of default go-to heuristic, and I think one of possibly the most important things you can at least learn to appreciate, even if you don't want to follow it yourself. Understanding why it's a principle, why it's a good way to look at understanding card games and matchups, I think will help you improve as a player. But before we get started with that, as always, we are going to discuss announcements and other things. You know, Direwolf has given us a little bit of a balance patch. I was surprised, Sonny. Were you surprised by this balance patch on the 8th?
Yeah, I didn't think anything was too egregious, although I guess Mandrakes were a lot of places, and they probably have good data on why they made the changes they made. But for the most part, it actually seemed like an opportunity to buff some cards more than anything.
So they nerfed Merriest Mandrake, which was the 0/4 that made ultimates cost half the cost. And then when you use an ultimate, you gain 2 life and draw a card. And then they also nerfed Venomous Nightshade, which was a 3-cost 3/3 that when you play an ultimate, your mage get +1 in deadly. Ultimate, when you gain life, play a Little Seed. And they both decreased both of their stats by 1 toughness. So they are now 0/3 and a 3/2 respectively. So what do you think of these two cards now that they're nerfed?
I think they're both still very good. They all have the same effects. It's just that they're a little more fragile now. And I think that's a good way to turn down the knob a little without being too drastic about it.
Yeah, it's a little bit sad that Merriest Mandrake had to take the hit after so long. But, you know, now that we have a number of ultimates that don't require costs, right, like Venomous Nightshade, where, you know, if you have Venomous Nightshade and Merriest Mandrake can play any ultimate you activate, will also trigger Venomous Nightshade and give you a bunch of deadly Mandrakes in play and draw you a bunch of cards. So Mandrakes having ultimates that don't have activation costs makes Merriest Mandrake a lot better, which you might not think because Merriest Mandrake's other text is, you know, to reduce it by half, right? But it turns out the more powerful part of Merriest Mandrake is the card draw, because you're probably playing cheap ultimates anyways, right? So like changing, you know, a veteran strategist to costing 1 versus 2 is not the biggest deal. What is the big deal is drawing the cards off of it.
Yeah, the other nerf that we have is Roland Iron Tyrant, the 2/5 Endurance Decay, and when an opposing unit dies, you get a 1/1 Deadly Valkyrie, and also it gets bigger. That one has been nerfed to be a 1/5 now, and I think this is good. We've seen Roland just be very, very powerful for a very long time, and makes it really tough to play like time strategies into it. I think that's still going to be the case, but you know, it's a small tune down for Roland, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think that this is a good nerf. I like the stat line better anyways as a 1/5. Like as a 2/5, it looks too powerful because its ability is a very powerful ability. So as a 1/5, it looks nicer in my opinion, just from an aesthetic perspective, but also from a gameplay perspective. You know, on one hand, it might look like, oh, it doesn't really have that much an effect, and you know that's partially true, but it has more effect than you think. For example, versus Yetis, Roland was a great way of just being like, oh, I win the game. But now, you know, if I play Roland and next turn my opponent plays the site and all of their Yetis are now X2s, they can all attack past Roland. You can block one, and then you can block it again next turn, then it finally dies. But the fact that now Roland can't block and kill X2s means that aggro decks can really attack past it in ways they couldn't before. You obviously can still kill things with Roland and then make it grow, but that was still possible before. So this, I think, will very much impact the aggro matchups with Roland, and it will decrease its efficiency and efficacy. And I think that is a good thing for Roland to have a little bit of lowered.
Yeah, I've rolled my eyes a lot of times when Roland hit the table, and I'm happy to do that a little less. All right, we have so-called Psy buff. Onorous Roa is now a 4-cost 5/4 instead of a 5-cost 5/5. I assume the Amplify text to gain life is the same. Seems like a pretty big buff to me. I mean, this basically makes it cost 1 cheaper.
Yeah, well, costing 1 cheaper is a big deal in card games. You might not know this, but there's like a meme like all time cards cost 4. Notice we're now cost 4.
Yeah.
Time needs a forecasting cost matters card. Like when you play a card that costs 4, do something.
Well, the thing about time is that like all of its units just have insane stats and like don't really do a whole ton else. So like the good ones would cost 4 and the bad ones would cost 5. Like that's basically what the distinction has been thus far. Anyway, let's talk about the other buffs really quickly. Laser Blast can now hit sites. Reality Warden now has Overwhelm. Customs Officer is now 4/3, and Dickrow's Technique can now kill a site that costs 6 or more in addition to a unit. And you mentioned before the cast that was mostly for what's it called? The Speaking Circle?
Yes, the Speaking Circle. Yeah, I think overall, letting things interact more is a good thing. The one that I'm the most scared of is Reality Warden. I mean, Reality Warden was a 5-cost 7/7. Now it's a 5-cost 7/7 Overwhelm. That's a big difference.
I feel like that card has needed that buff for a very long time. Reality Warden, I think it's been in the game as long as the game has existed, and it's now finally maybe going to see some play because it can actually do something aside from getting chump blocked.
If you consider 4 faction Sling.
We already know how I feel about Sling decks.
Yes, but what if we add a faction to Sling, Sunny?
Okay,
hard to cap.
So, draft packs. We have a few additions to draft packs, which means that these cards will also be legal in Expedition. Some notables in this include Phoenix Stone, Incendiary Slagmite, Moonstone Vanguard, and Plague, and also Iron Fist Chancellor. These cards are not slam dunk playables, but I think they've seen a little bit of play here and there. So in Expedition, where the card pool is more limited, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw some of those cards make it into the format.
Yeah, Phoenix Stone has in the past been a very good aggro card, although this is the sort of change, the sort of nerfed state kind of with Phoenix Stone, where it used to be 2 and activate for 2, and now it's 1 activate for 3. But it has been a very good aggressive card in the past, and maybe that's something Expedition needs, because Expedition is not very an aggro format. It's very chonky things chonking each other. Moonstone Vanguard obviously is a Sentinel, a very good Sentinel, as a matter of fact. Having Pledge is just nice, and it's powerful now. It's a 5/5 again, so I can see that Slagmite is a aggressive Grenadin, which Grenadin is the premier aggro deck in the format, so giving them the tool is a good thing. Plague is kind of there, maybe. Iron Fist Chancellor is kind of there, maybe. Again, the format's a lot weaker than Throne, so maybe this is the time for Chancellor, who knows?
Yeah, I'm looking at these cards, and Send an Agent is in Expedition, right? I haven't played a ton of Expedition lately, so yeah. So all these cards just die to Send an Agent, and that's in the most represented deck right now. So
that's true.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine any of these making a huge impact out of the gate, but there'll be nice options. I don't know. In a format with Send an Agent, or just in a format that has fast removal instead of sweepers, if people aren't leaning on sweepers, then Phoenix Stone looks a lot worse.
One of the most played cards in Expedition is Equalize currently.
Oh, okay. All right.
Equalize is huge.
Okay, so Phoenix Stone does dodge that.
Yes.
Better than just playing like some sort of flyer in that case. It's better than playing like, I don't know if Thunder Wings is in Expedition, but something similar to that effect.
Sure. Yeah, I think Phoenix Stone was definitely going to be good in the market versus like the Combray decks, which I think are good Expedition decks. It's also good versus sites, right? If your opponent plays Speaking Circle or if they play Tower, you can play Phoenix Stone and attack for 4 in the air, which is going to be enough to kill most sites. Not Gates of Hope, but most of the other sites.
Yeah, if someone plays Gates of Hope, you probably don't care too much anyway.
So that's it for this small little balance patch. They buffed 4 cards, side buffed 1, nerfed 3, and added 10 cards to the expedition. So a cute little balance patch. Always appreciating seeing cards get buffed. So I like it. I think the nerfs are well represented and not terrible. They don't kill cards, which is nice. So yeah, all in all, I think it's perfectly fine balance patch.
Yeah, and notable, no announcement about a 2021 season, although I don't really think that anyone is expecting that this soon either. Well, I don't know. I guess some people are, but I'm not. I think that's a ways off.
We'll get it when we get it. Hopefully, we get it soon. We're obviously, as always, we are presupposing this is going to happen.
I think it's likely. I also don't think that it's going to come without any fanfare. I think that it's not going to be just like dropped on us. I think that we'll have some hints ahead of time if they're getting close to that.
They'll be like, we're going to have an important announcement in a week, and then people are like, ooh, an important announcement that could be organized play, and then it's like, here's a premium sigil pack. I don't think Darryl would do that, but as always, we just want to hype up Tuesday Night Eternal a bit again. So it took its winter holiday break, but Tuesday Night Eternal has returned. They did their first 2021 tournament earlier today as we were recording this. It was the first Throne tournament with Empire of Glass cards.
Yeah, geez, it feels like Empire of Glass has been out for a while now.
Yeah, it was out during the holidays, and I think things took like a 2-week break, so like that did cause that to happen. I mean, it really does feel like Empire of Glass has been out for so long.
Wait, no. Okay, the last one in the 22nd of December definitely had it.
But that was an expedition tournament. I specified Throne, Sonny.
Okay.
Anyways, congrats to Apple Chips for winning with one of my favorite archetypes in Throne, Time Justice Shadow Ramp, and Vision Value if you prefer. And it's notably their second victory in the Tuesday Night Eternal circuit. We've had 5 tournaments, and Apple Chips has won 2 of them. That's a good showing from them. And then finally, for Tuesday Night Eternal, I just like to say, hey, I offered to come back, and it looks like, provided nothing goes wrong, I should be returning to cast on the 26th for that tournament, which will once again be Expedition. So that'll be fun. From my perspective, I enjoyed casting it the last time, and hopefully you guys enjoyed hearing me cast the tournament.
I'm pretty sad that there actually was a break for the holidays. I was excited because I was like, okay, 2 weeks from this Tuesday, I'm actually free for like the previous Tuesday tournament. But it turns out they had an extra week off and I'm back to work and can't participate. So that makes me sad. But, always good to see what's going on in the competitive circuit. So before we get on to our big thing about Who's the Beatdown, just want to say a few things following up on the last episode. First of all, we had a reply to the video on YouTube. Lights Out Ace said that their highlight was winning Worlds, which makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think most people would be pretty pleased with winning Worlds, and that's good enough to be the highlight of the year. So pretty easy slam dunk there. And something we forgot to mention, one of the great things that happened in 2020 that we just totally forgot about is the Eternal Celebration. I think it was really cool how everyone had access to accounts that had all the cards, and that there was a big tournament at the end with 4 spots up for grabs. That was a really cool event. It didn't impact you or me too much, Stormblessed, because both of us were already qualified and already have accounts that have plenty of resources in them. But definitely it was a good thing to see, and we're sorry that we forgot about it when we were talking about 2020 in the last episode.
Yeah, it was a very cool event. It's funny that before the cast we're talking about it. I'm like, oh yeah, that was a thing, right? So it's like, yeah, it just didn't impact us. I'm like, because we already have most of the cards, so like we didn't care about the price. Like it's like, oh, there was also a tournament, and I'm like, oh yeah, there was a big tournament at the end of it. Because like it's just funny because he's right. We already qualified, so it just was different for the two of us. But yes, it was a very cool event. And obviously we got to see Cassandrith do well at the tournament, which was fun from our testing group, Cassandrith. So that was cool having him qualify through that part.
Yeah, Doc28 also won that tournament, who writes articles about Eternal every now and then.
Yeah, so that was a very cool event. Okay, so moving to our main topic, we are going to discuss who is the Beatdown. This is at this point, old, rather classic concept from Magic the Gathering. As always, a lot of these basic card game principles come from Magic the Gathering. Who's the Beatdown is just a way of trying to understand the game. And specifically here, it's a way of reducing down decks and games into two categories: the Beatdown and the Control. Under this idea, there's no mid-range, no combo, no mid-range aggro with combo finishes. Just plain and simple, two categories: Beatdown and Control.
Yeah, this affects what is going on in the game that you're playing. It doesn't matter how your deck compares to other decks that are outside this game when you're actually playing it, because you're just playing against one deck at a time. And that's when it's important to know when you're the beatdown and when you're not the beatdown. And I just want to throw in, this is the article must be 2 decades old by this point, but it was originally articulated, or at least it's known for being in an article written by Mike Flores in the Duelist magazine, I believe. So if you think about Magic the Gathering around the turn of the millennia, around 2000, I think that's when this originates from, but I don't have the exact date.
Yeah, this is an almost 20-year-old idea, but it's just as applicable to any card you're playing. If you're playing Magic, you're playing Eternal, you're playing Legends of Runeterra, Hearthstone, the idea of who's the beatdown is applicable to all of them. At this point, it's kind of fundamental in some aspects if you're trying to be a aficionado on card game theory. So why do we care who is the beatdown? Like, why does that matter? So to simply put it, in most games played, there will be one person who is trying to win faster and one person who is trying to win slower. The person trying to win faster is the beatdown, and the control player is the one who has what we like to call inevitability. To succinctly put it, if the game goes long enough, the beatdown player will lose the game and the control player will win the game. Now, as always, these sort of ideas are generally speaking, and there are various exceptions that some of them we'll get into in a bit. But just overall, if a deck goes long enough and will win the matchup, it is considered the control deck under this game theory.
So where this comes up is deciding on how to sequence your plays or when to attack or hold back, because a lot of the time there's going to be, like you said, there's going to be one person who's trying to kill the opponent, basically, and then there's another person that's trying to prevent that. Okay, so there are like two types of games that happen pretty frequently, and this doesn't matter that much from a gameplay perspective, but just like something that you can observe at the end of the game. A lot of times there'll be a game where I'm at full health, for example, and my opponent is dead, right? I played an aggro deck, my opponent can deal with it fast enough, they never touched me, and I just killed them. And then there are a lot of games where my opponent's life total is low, but the game is over, and I'm still at full health, basically. And then I lose shortly thereafter. If you're wondering where full health concessions come from, a lot of the times that's what's going on. I attack my opponent down to a really low life total, and then they stabilize, and then they do something big, and I can't really deal with it, and I lose all my resources, and I lose. You would expect, like, a lot of the times the life totals of both players would be dropping, but it turns out that doesn't happen as often as you might think. Usually, one of the two scenarios I described happens one way or another.
That's a good way to put it. It's kind of like life is a resource, right? That's another classic idea. Life is a resource. Spend your life as a resource. But it also comes back to the fact that while you do eventually have to defeat people by reducing their life to zero, not all games end because of life totals. In a lot of ways, this control inevitability is obtained not by putting zero, which they can eventually, but by just sort of running them out of resources or just having more of them. You sort of saw this idea somewhat with Collector versus Lights Out Ace in Worlds, where Collector had to take the role of the beatdown in the matchup, and you played out to the very end, like the very, very end. But there was a couple of games in this matchup that you saw where, rightly so, Collector had, very small outs, and you got to play to your outs, right? If you have like a 1% out to win a game at Worlds, you 100% keep playing until you get to zero life. But for the most part, if it was like on a ladder game, whatever, you might just concede, because even though Lights Out Ace was at like 10 and Collector was at like 25, odds are that once the game reaches a point where Ace had enough cards in hand, Elysian doesn't have enough cards in hand, Elysian's out of resources. Now Elysian's a bit of an oddball there, because Elysian does have catch-up mechanisms, specifically with Helio. If you're behind in cards, just at any point you just top deck a Helio, so it's a little bit of a different situation. But I hope you guys understand the idea behind what I'm saying here.
Yeah, we're simplifying it quite a bit, like a lot, but the general concept is important. Something that I've also heard, I forget where I heard this, but maybe it was Farming Eternal. Games shouldn't be a race very often. If both players are racing, that means that one person is racing a losing race. Like they're losing in the race, but they're deciding to race anyway. And that'll happen sometimes because it's a game of imperfect information. You don't know all the cards that your opponent has. Like if you have a card that's really good in a race, like, +3/+3 in lifesteal or something, then that can catch someone off guard when they committed to a race that they can't win. But generally speaking, the player shouldn't be racing. One person should be trying to end the game, the other person should be trying to prolong the game, and whoever succeeds in their goal is going to win.
Yeah.
Another thing that happens is that sometimes you'll be in like a mirror match. Let's just say a vision value mirror match, I guess, and one person redraws to 6, but they have the backbreaker. So usually you don't want to play backbreaker until you have a unit in front of it. But if you are behind on resources, if your opponent just has more resources than you, you just can slam that backbreaker and try to hope to end the game quickly before your opponent is able to leverage their resources. So I think times like that, even in a mirror match, it's important to be able to identify if you're the beatdown or if you should be trying to prolong the game. And that should advise your in-game decisions.
Reduced to even simpler, you want to know what your path to victory is. Is your path to victory winning the game sooner or winning the game later? And if your path to victory is winning the game sooner, if you know that you just can't win the long game, then you have to make lines that maybe put you down on resources. You maybe you 2-for-1 yourself, but you know that you get a temporary advantage and you know that you have to win the game quicker. So you make the plays that you make because you want to find your plan to win every matchup, the games and the matchups.
There are some tools that you can use in order to try to figure out if you are the beatdown. Because, if you're playing a matchup, one deck is usually the beatdown against the other deck, but it's not always going to break that way. Sometimes rules change, sometimes, circumstances in the game give one player the inevitability when they wouldn't usually have it. So let's back up a tiny bit and talk about just attacking. So units, I know this is pretty far back, but units, when you play them, they deal damage to the opponent equal to their attack every single turn until they are nullified, basically. If a unit isn't attacking, blocking, or preventing a unit from attacking, then you wasted your time playing it. So basically, when you play a unit, you want to be attacking with it whenever possible. It's really easy to miss opportunities when you have an available attack and just forget about it. I mean, for example, this comes up in Limited a lot more, but if you're playing a deck that's generally pretty slow and you have an open attack with like your random 2/2 and your opponent has an exhausted 4/3 and you can't block it anyway, you just attack. This will help bring your opponent life total lower and make it so that when you have to do math about calculating clocks, which I'll get to in a second, you'll just be in a more favorable position. Okay, so I mentioned clocks. This is a way, generally speaking, of deciding whether you should be attacking or not. I think the biggest epiphany I had with this is I was watching, I think it was a semifinals match for some big Magic tournament, and both players are on aggressive decks. One person has a 5/5 and is at 4 life, and the opposing person has a 1/1 and is at 20 life. So the person with the 5/5 had to make a decision whether they wanted to attack. They're at 4 life. Okay, both players have nothing in their hand. Their opponent's at 20 and they have a 1/1. So it's not hard to imagine like a small charging unit coming off the top of their deck means that the game's over if they make an attack. Otherwise, they'd be able to block it if they hold back with the 5/5. But they just, I don't think they even thought about it too much. They just went straight into the attack. And I had to think about this for a long time. At first, I thought that was not good because they needed to prolong the game, gather more resources, deal with the 1/1, and be able to finish off the game. But it turns out they were the beatdown. They had to do something. If the other player had gotten like a direct damage spell or something, they'd just be in a worse position. And the player at 4 life had already drawn their card for the turn, so the opponent would get the first draw after that. So attacking the opponent down to 15, then 10, then 5, then 0 was the game plan for the player with the 5/5, and that would happen faster than the opponent attacking for 1 4 times to get them down to 0. I think there are situations like that where it's not immediately obvious if you should be attacking or not, but you just got to do the calculation. If the board stays exactly the same, who is winning faster? And if the answer is you, then that means you should be attacking or trying to force your attacks through. One more thing that I want to mention that can help you decide whether you're supposed to be beating down or not, and that is power efficiency. This is a way you can identify early in the game whether you should be attacking quickly. If you have your 1-drop trade with your opponent's 3-drop, basically regardless of what else happened, that probably means that you are on the beatdown because you had higher power efficient. You should just be trying to force all your power through, use all your power in an aggressive manner because your opponent has made a favorable trade, and they'll always be a couple steps behind, which means that you'll have plenty of good attacks to make.
Let's use an example. Let's say power is equal to 2 2s, right? 1 power is equal to a 2-2.
Yeah.
If you spend 10 power and you play 10 2-2s, your opponent has to spend 2 power for every one of your 2-2s. So they spend 10 power, but they only kill 5 of your 2-2s. That means that you have 5 2-2s left over, and you're killing your opponent with the extra power. Every time they don't kill a 2-2, you just keep getting attacked for 2 extra damage each time. And then that also adds up, because if they can only kill 1, then you'll have 2 left over the next turn. So you can sort of build up an advantage where the power snowballs, right? If you have a 2-1 in play for 3 turns, you got an extra 6 damage. So even if they eventually do kill it, you still get the advantage off the power earlier on, right? As Sunny said, if you have a unit in play, you're investing power onto the board state. Unlike, having a card in hand, that if you don't play anything, you don't using your power. If you play a 2-drop and you keep attacking with it, you don't have to invest 2 power into every turn, right? One of the downsides, one of the reasons that Phoenix Stone was overlooked for so long is that unlike a traditional unit, you do have to invest power to Phoenix Stone. Now, it turns out Phoenix Stone had other advantages, but overall, it was overlooked for a very long time just because it, unlike a regular unit, you had to keep investing power into it again and again, whereas regular units, you don't have to. Every turn that they live, every turn they get to attack, you're basically getting free value from them.
Yes, and that's basically why I led this whole thing off with, if you have a unit, it deals damage equal to its attack to the opposing player until it is nullified.
Yes, there are obviously exceptions. Merriest Mandrake, Trailmaker, Aurelian Merchant, these are units that, might not attack and might not block, but of course, units have abilities and things are more complicated than we're saying. We do understand these people. But overall, like Rakano Outlaw. If you're not attacking with it, you're not blocking with it, what is the purpose of Rakano Outlaw?
Yeah. It's not doing anything, and it's putting you behind. So this power efficiency, you can make observations for how your cards line up with your opponents, and the person who is trading more efficiently is often going to be the beatdown in these types of games.
So the information of who's the beatdown, you start thinking about this from a matchup perspective. What usually happens between decks. Like Elysian versus Yetis is going to be usually the beatdown, right? So you might have an opening hand. If you know the matchup in advance, or if you see your opponent go turn 1 Yeti, right? You'd be like, oh, in Elysian, I have to, figure out how I'm going to sequence my cards to match up versus the beatdown because I have the inevitability. Once you know what the matchup is, you can be like, what is my role in the matchup? And you can be like, okay, here's how I want to sequence my hand because I know what my goal is. What my goal is to win a little bit slower or win a little bit faster.
It's the difference between cards that try to end the game or cards that try to prolong the game. That's usually what you're deciding upon, lines of play.
The tricky part here is that your role in a matchup can also change in the middle of the match. And it's why decks like Elysian are so difficult to play, because not only does the role in matchups differ wildly between decks, Elysian can play any role at any point because just has so many options and so many ways the deck plays out, which makes it tricky. But also in the middle of the match, one of the more likely scenarios for a deck like Elysian or like Spellcrag to find itself switching is versus, again, an aggro deck like Yetis or Mono Fire. At some point, you might find yourself, your opponent has a mostly empty board, a mostly empty hand, you're at 7 life, or 5 life, or 4 life even. At that point, you gotta switch gears. You gotta just on a dime, you gotta realize, wait a minute, my opponent can start top decking burn spells or saving up or an expedition like Pyrotech Explosion. So you gotta be like, oh wait, suddenly I need to win the game sooner because my game goes long enough. At a certain point, the Yetis will end up winning, surprisingly. The Yetis become the control almost. And so it's important to know when you have to shift gears from one set of the matchups to the other.
Yeah, maybe that's why I've never been good at control decks, is because I can never figure out when that time is. But yeah, that's absolutely true. These rules aren't just based on matchups. It depends on how the game has been set up, and then it depends on what happens in the game, because these can shift even within the same game.
Yeah, so another quick point I'd like to make before I get to some examples is I just want to bring up the notion of combo decks. In sort of the traditional label, a combo deck would be a deck that does its thing and then at some point has a combo finish that ends the game. A lot of people disagree with me, but I think Prodigious Sorcery plus Static Bolt or Prodigious Sorcery plus At Any Cost is a sort of combo. I think Reanimator is a sort of combo, Talir is a sort of combo. So those three different combos are all wildly different, right? Reanimator would be the beatdown in a lot of matchups because it's trying to get its combo as soon as possible. The Talir is sort of both roles, which I'll get to what both roles mean. It can be aggro or control depending on the matchup, because the deck itself also has the not combo potential as well. And then finally, at any cost is obviously the control deck. It wants to go on long enough because it has to draw into its combo pieces as well as get enough shadow influence, right? Whereas Reanimator is trying to turn the deck as soon as possible and has so much more redundancy than a deck like At Any Cost does because it's trying to do it thing as fast as possible. So that's one of the reasons that just saying something's like combo deck can be less useful than thinking even in the terms of who's the beatdown, because both At Any Cost and Reanimator are combo decks, but the way you have to approach any matchup involving them is so different.
It's all about what the matchup is at the time, and that's what we're talking about, because there are going to be matchups where Reanimator might be the aggro, like against a deck that has really powerful hate for it or a way to shut off its game plan, like Luminor Reclaimer is in the market. The onus is on the Reanimator deck to do its thing before it gets shut off. And then there are going to be times where, like against an aggro deck, it's going to be a control deck because it has to survive and make sure it can do its thing to stop what the aggro deck is doing. Anyway, just a reminder, all of these are contextual and also based on what is going on in the game. So when we talk about a certain matchup being a certain way, that can also change depending on what actually goes on in game.
Yeah, that's a good disclaimer because the next points that are going to be made here are sort of overall from a matchup perspective, comparing two decks that are of the same sort of archetype of the way that people like to label decks. Let's discuss various two aggro deck situations. So who's the beatdown when you have, say, a mono fire deck versus a Kira deck? In many ways, Kira is versus a lot of matchups, Kira is the aggro deck. Kira is the one that is going to put the pressure on and put it quick. With its burst damage through Kira and through Hojin, it wants to put aggression on the opponent. But Mono Fire is a faster deck. It plays 1-drops where Kira plays 2-drops and sort of 3-drops. More 3-drops than 2-drops even. Because Kira and Hojin are usually you could think of them as 3-drops, 2-drops that are vulnerable. So in that matchup, Kira tends to play more of a control role, right? It keeps the Hojin back and leaves up the Levitate to put on the Hojin to gain some life, to sort of stabilize, and then eventually provide the sort of combo finish that Kira can do.
Yeah, I'd say so too. And this isn't like us saying that you shouldn't attack with your Hojans. Like, obviously, when you give your Hojan lifesteal, you want to attack with it. But for example, like if you don't have a natural power drop and the decision is use Levitate on Hojan or maybe Silverblade Intrusion and block versus just use it preemptively and attack into it, you probably want to go for the line that will prolong the game and hold back and block until you can gain a really big advantage one way or another, like drawing more power to make sure that you can just fuel the Hojan naturally. Or maybe if you have a Trickshot Ruffian in your deck or Finest Hour, then there will be a turn that you can gain a lot of life in once in order to try to close it out.
Another way to look at it is do you play a Hojin on turn 2, right? You might instead actually play Kira on turn 2 because Kira is in many ways the less important card of the matchup. You play Kira on turn 2, you let Kira get removed, you play Hojin on turn 3 with backup up, so that if the opponent does attack, you can then, or if the opponent tries to remove the Hojin, you can play the Silverblade Intrusion or play the Levitate to get a good life swing that you need to win the game. So another classic matchup for two aggro decks would be Mono Fire versus Yetis. These are probably the two fastest decks in Eternal that we've seen ever. And you're like, who's the beatdown? Who's the control here? Well, in many ways, it kind of comes down to who's on the play versus who's on the draw.
Yeah.
If you're on the draw, you're the control. If you're on the play, you're the aggro. Now, there are various forms of Mono Fire versus Yetis, so I think it is more likely that Mono Fire will find itself in the control route, especially if it's playing cards like Jack. Jack and Milos are going to be bigger than the Yetis units. So, for example, as Sunny said, look at power efficiency. Yetis is playing cheaper units, therefore it will tend to be the aggro deck. But the other way to look at it is who's on the play versus who's on the draw. Having the extra card, having the not extra turn really means that you have to have only be on the back foot, especially in an aggro matchup.
Yeah, and I think the importance is most pronounced in aggro matchups. Like, if you're making an attack when you shouldn't be making an attack in an aggro matchup, it might be your doom. There have been a lot of times where I'm thinking to myself, why is my opponent attacking? And that just opens the door for me to, like, break the floodgates and just come pouring down. If I am the beatdown, but, like, just barely, and then they make an attack, or do something to try to speed up the game instead of prolong it, then that's like a really easy victory. So I think a lot of people say that playing aggro is mindless. I mean, I don't, like, well-respected players don't say that anymore, right? Or like never said that. But that is something that you come across every once in a while. And you just come into situations with matchups like these where not knowing if you're the beatdown or not and not being able to assign it correctly is a really, really big deal.
Yeah, aggro is not a mindless deck. It can have mindless games sometimes, mindless in quotes, where like if the opponent never does anything, you can just run them over. If they play, Petition, Silex, Treasure Trove, then you just run them over. But that's one of the benefits of being the aggro deck, is that you get the games where you can just run your opponent over like that if they stumble. But aggro really, what it is that the skill testing moments, they come up sooner and they're more pronounced. Because the game goes on longer, you have less opportunity to make mistakes, and the mistakes you make will cost you more. So control versus control has often been called the battle of who can make the least mistakes, or who can make the fewest mistakes, or who can make the last mistake, because that game goes on for a very long time. So the mistakes can sort of accumulate over time. Whereas in an aggro matchup, you make a mistake and boom, you're dead.
Yeah, but also in the control matchups, you have to keep in mind that some of the like not making mistakes is not mistakenly assigning the beatdown.
Yeah.
If you don't think your opponent's the beatdown, you play Honor of Claws instead of playing, I don't know, a merchant or something, getting on the board in some way or another, and your opponent goes Garden of Omens into something else that impacts the board into like, I don't know. I don't know like exactly what the sequence of plays is here, but like if you spend a turn just drawing cards where you really can't afford to give up that initiative like that, then you can be in a lot of trouble. So, knowing when you're about to be under fire versus when you're not about to be under fire is really important there.
Speaking of that, we're going to move on from our aggro deck section to talk about two control decks facing off either. Like, who is the beatdown in, say, a Spellcrag versus At Any Cost matchup? This is a much trickier situation. In many ways, it comes down to the same thing of Mono Fire versus Yetis. Two very similar decks with pronounced differences that want to do very similar things, and it'll come down to not so much play versus draw as with the aggro mirrors, but it'll come down to how the matchup progresses. I believe Spellcrag would be the beatdown in this sense. Spellcrag has Garden. It wants to search out for Preacher Sorcery a lot faster. And At Any Cost has the more explosive finish. Because At Any Cost, it gets to 12, and it plays namesake card At Any Cost, then doubles it and does it can do upwards of 60 damage, like lifesteal. Spellcrag has to be able to win the game before At Any Cost for 12 damage can happen. Now, there's a lot of weirdness because they both play Transpose and they play, lots of Face Ages, and it can be a pretty crazy matchup. Again, I gotta switch gears when you gotta switch gears, and that's really tricky to do. But overall, I believe Spellcrag would be the beatdown in the matchup.
There's so many different factors in this.
I also kind of think that playing Honor of Claws is the beatdown's move in many ways in the unitless matchups. It really depends on, again, the matchup, what's going on. Does the opponent have Face Ages or not? But oftentimes, playing a merchant might not do anything, whereas drawing extra cards sooner might draw you into your combo finishes that you're trying to get to. or your counter spells or whatever. So in some sense, drawing cards can be the aggressive move in the unitless matchups.
Yeah, well, I look at it this way. Drawing cards is basically saying, you're not the beatdown right now, so I'm going to get an advantage. Does that make sense? Like, in a situation where your opponent does not have a way of speeding up the game, they can't punish you for drawing cards.
In a unitless matchup, Genev Merchant is not going to speed up the game. Genev Merchant is there to grab like Royal Decree or Scourge of Frostome or whatever, and the beatdown move is draw your cards. How does the unitless matchup win? Well, it wins by drawing its finisher sooner. It's very different than an aggro matchup. An aggro v aggro is unitless v unitless. At least that's my expectation.
Okay, so like, yes, a Genev Merchant probably isn't doing a ton, but again, if it goes unchecked for too long, then all of a sudden the person that is on the receiving end of the Genev Merchant realizes that their life total is a lot lower, and they're a lot more prone to being beat down by the other cards in the opponent's deck.
Sure.
If you just ignore something like that, they have to make some sort of response in that. If their plan is draw cards, draw cards, draw cards, and you just play a 2-3 with Aegis, all of a sudden your opponent might have a million cards, but not the power in which to deploy them all. And if you keep on deploying threats, then you can win that way. It's it's really tricky. I'm no expert on playing control mirrors, certainly not. But there are going to be times where something that like is really embarrassing but still puts a little bit of pressure has a really big outcome on the game. You have to make sure that you don't let those things just determine the game if you're on the receiving end of someone playing a Genev Merchant.
The other example matchup I wanted to present will lead us into our next category as well. If you look at two Throne Worlds, if you look at Lights Out Aces, World Championship Ixtun control list versus No Targs Feln at any cost list, who's the beatdown there? Well, unfortunately for Lights Out Ace has to be the beatdown because Lights Out Ace, I believe they don't have any counter spells in their list at all. They have like one Royal Decree in the market, but No Targ has Face Aegis, and Lights Out Ace has to be able to win before at any cost happens, right? Even Scourge doesn't necessarily win the game because No Targ has 4 Ikarias in their deck and has, if they would go to the market first, they can also use their market cards to try to maybe take out the Scourge. The version of Ixtun control that Lights Out Ace played at Worlds is disproportionately disfavored versus Spellcrag or any cost decks, which leads into my next category of what defines a bad matchup. The true worst matchup is when one deck is both the beatdown and the control, when they're both putting the pressure on and they have the inevitability. Now, that's not exactly Lights Out Ace versus No Targ because Lights Out Ace can try to apply beatdown, but they don't do a very good job at it, and No Targ definitely has the inevitability in that matchup. For example of this classic quote-unquote worst matchup would be the classic Reanimator deck versus FJS classic Wind Chest or similar variants of that same archetype, especially when Wind Chest is not playing Void Hate in the market, whether it's through Gavel or anything else. And the answer is because classic Reanimator, say, for example, that very first ECQ that Isomorphic brought Reanimator to, where no one expected it, no one had any idea what was going to happen. That deck moves quickly, right? It puts out a lot of pressure early, but also it can put out a lot of pressure late. So by being both the beatdown and the control, it just had an unbelievably good matchup versus FJS.
Yeah, and I think that usually when we talk about these matchups that are really good one way or really bad one way, a lot of the time it comes down to the axis of interaction. If you remember 3 axes of victory from the deck building podcast we did a long time ago, that is episode 38 if you haven't heard it, and if you haven't, I would recommend checking it out because we talk about some really interesting considerations that I don't think are talked about very often. So you'll have these situations where one deck is just really poorly positioned to deal with the opponent, usually because the card's effectiveness in that deck are just like not there. So then it has to try to like claw together a victory in something that it's not well set up to do. And usually I would say that like that deck is the beatdown in those scenarios, but it's like not doing a very effective job of it.
So finally, to sort of finish off my discussion on who's the beatdown, I just would like to say that, the Eternal community, as far as I've seen it, loves to label decks. They love to argue about which decks deserve what labels. When Rakano was first unveiled at the Rakano ECQ, there was big arguments in the Twitch chat about what do we label the deck? What do we label the deck? Is it a combo deck? Is it an aggro deck? Is it a mid-range deck? What do we label it? So you can sort of still apply these concepts to your labels. So I still use mid-range, I still use combo, I still use those as terminologies when I discuss labeling decks. But for how I choose to label things is a little different. So, for example, I think Elysian and Xenon both usually fit as mid-range decks, because if a deck can play both roles across many different matchups, or is the deck most likely to change its role, I'd call it a mid-range deck. And Elysian being, aggro in some matchups, control in some matchups, or because the deck is so flexible, depending on your opening hand, they tend to be very mid-rangey. Combo decks, I think of anything to put the appended combo on as having some sort of explosive finish to sort of win the game out of nowhere, with quotes around, like to win the game out of nowhere, right? Which is why I thought that Rakano was sort of an aggro combo deck, because it had a very aggressive start and did very aggressive things, but then also had this sort of combo-esque finish with Trickshot Ruffian / Mantle of Justice to sort of, get in for like 22 damage in a single instant, which felt very combo to me. But of course, the important part in keep remembering is, even when you think of things like that, is to think about how that relates to the matchups, right? So like if you're looking at Rakano with aggro combo, be aware that, yes, it can have an explosive finish, but also it's trying to apply pressure. So you got to be able to think about how it fits there. So yeah, I still use the terms mid-range. I still use the terms combo. Like that's also why people are like, Vision Value is a mid-range deck, and I'm like, it's not a mid-range deck. It's a control deck, because yes, it's playing 24 units, but all the units have like 2 power, and they cost all like 4. So it's very much a control deck. It's trying to win the long game. It has the inevitability, right? Through Know Thy Enemy, through Display of Vision to eke out value, through petitions, through Diana, right? Diana activates for 12 as its ultimate, depending on the version of the deck, right? If you're playing like a deck that Apple just brought to Tuesday Night Eternal, it's playing Martial Ironthorn, it's playing the Speaking Circle, cards that will win the games eventually. So it's definitely not a mid-range deck. It has no real way of winning the mid game. So that's, it's a control deck because it has the ability. But in some matchups, it has to be the beatdown. Going back to the matchup that we speculated on for so long during World Season, but never panned out to happen, was Lights Out Aces Ixton Control versus my Vision Value for Throne. The way I was looking at the matchup was that I had to be the beatdown in that matchup, right? Not like a super heavy beatdown, but like I thought the matchup was good, because I thought that I could play the beatdown while I thought I also had a decent control game, which is, again, why I thought it was a good matchup, because I thought it did both roles reasonably. So yeah, labeling things I think is still useful. It's just important to know that labeling things is just a heuristic. Why you choose to label things matter. You don't fight too hard for a label. It really matters how the deck plays out and how the matchups play out. And every game is different, right? And this is one of the most skill testing parts in a card game, is to decide when you're the beatdown and when you're the control.
Just another reminder that everything is relative. Doesn't matter if your deck is control 99 times out of 100 if you're in that one position where you can't play the control. You can't be the one trying to prolong the game if you hope to win. So when you're playing, just make sure that you think to yourself, if this game goes on 5 more turns, am I going to be in a better spot or in a spot that's not as good? If it is the latter, that means that you got to try to end the game quickly or take steps toward ending the game. So just keep that in mind when you're playing. And if you don't have that in mind, if you don't really have a plan like that, you might find yourself giving up easy wins to your opponent.
Well, that about wraps up this episode of FECast. I hope you all enjoyed. I've been alluding this for some time, if you guys have been a long-time listener. So I hope you all enjoyed hearing a sort of brief overview of my main heuristic. Like this is literally the primary way that I start to think about card games, matchups, and decks, and just overall card game theory. So I do think that it's possible we will visit this topic in the future, because this is a very complicated issue, and I think Who's the Beatdown Redux might see a comeback, although I will stop alluding to it quite as much because we have now covered it. But yeah, so I hope we can cover more interesting topics in the future, and I hope you enjoyed this week's FEcast. I hope you return to us next week, and until then, stay in the friend zone.
The Friends of Eternal Discord is the best place on the internet to get better at Eternal. We have players of all skill and experience levels all happy to help each other out on basically any aspect of their Eternal gameplay. And making all this possible is our generous patrons over at patreon.com. If you'd like to support FEcast or Friends of Eternal, consider donating at patreon.com/Friends of Eternal. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, we'll see you in the friend zone.